We demystify what goes on behind the therapy room door. Join us on this voyage of discovery and co-creative conversations. This is the Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast, with Bob Cooke and Jacci Jones.
Welcome back to the next episode of the Therapy Show Behind Closed Doors with the wonderful Mr. Bob Cooke, as always, and myself, Jacci Jones. And just to let you know that we're not going to do what we had scheduled for this week. We're going to postpone that for a few weeks. So we're not doing the podcast on ADHD. What we're going to be doing is far more exciting. The importance of reviews and reflection in the therapy process.
Good title. I might be the one from Mr. Cooke, and you're the marvellous Jacci Jones.
Thank you. Thank you.
And no, ADHD I do know a lot about, but I wanted to have some more time for thinking about it, because I did a weekend on ADHD a couple of weekends ago, and there's 3 different types of ADHD, and I'd like to talk about them in a bit more detail. So, but this one's really interesting because there's a TA therapist like you and me are. For my first training was in TA, and I know your training was in TA. Yeah. We're born and bred with the idea of contracts.
Absolutely, yes.
And therefore, we, as a TA therapist, should always work with a contract. In other words, we help people facilitate. That's the right word, yeah. Taking ownership of what the goal is in therapy.
Yeah.
And because if they don't, they're coming from quite a powerless, passive place, which might, of course, replicate their history. So we work with contracts, overall contracts, sessional contracts, what might happen in the sessions. And also, of course, what we're talking about here, when we review what's been happening in the actual therapy process, how far they've got in actually or not in achieving the therapy goal. And I think reviews and reflections are a really important part of a psychotherapy process where people can take stock, can celebrate their changes or not, and look at where they're going in a more reflective way. So
I agree, because I think this is a really important part. It's not just about the contracting. It's not just about having a treatment plan and a pathway and knowing where we're going. It is about reviewing and reflecting on the changes that have been made, or like you said, not work still to be done. But I want to say often, but that could be just me presuming. I don't think we reflect or review enough sometimes in therapy.
No, I think what happens, I agree with you completely. I think what happens, and I think it also depends slightly about how psychotherapists are trained in terms of what they think about reviews and reflections. So, for example, and some people listening to this podcast might not think CBT is a therapy, but I know it's the NHS favoured therapeutic approach. Now, in CBT, for example, reflections and reviews particularly are tailored in.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm not a short-term focused therapist. However, I do like the idea of reviews.
Yeah.
Because they're a good marker for change or not change. And both are important markers.
Absolutely, both are as important. Is that kind of like the CBT? I don't know that much about it. There's like a form to fill out at the beginning, and then say there's another form after a month and 6 weeks or whatever. So there's kind of a continuation of reflection and reviews on it. Whereas in transactional analysis, we don't tend to fill out forms as such.
Yeah, and what you have in CBT a lot, of course, is homeworking.
Yes, yeah.
And also plotting or looking at behavioural change and cognitive thinking changes, often done through homework.
Yeah.
So it's a different type of psychotherapy. Having said that, I do know TA therapists who integrate homeworking as well, but it is a different process. Sorry, I got a cough here. So I think one of the most important reflections of change is when the person reports back there's been no change. So without reviewing and reflecting, we may miss what's not been happening, which is as important as what is happening in the therapy room.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And the other really important reflection I would encourage therapists to help their clients in the therapy process with is a reflection on what I'm going to talk about: emotional literacy, emotional regulation, and the ability to reflect on internal world and external world. In other words, what's happening for them internally as well as what's happening for them externally.
Yeah. And has that altered or changed in any way? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because quite often clients come in and they may not reflect at all on
Yeah.
their internal world, and they may not even connect that external behavior is a manifestation of what's happening. Sorry, external behaviors are a manifestation of what's happening internally.
Yeah.
Helping the client reflect on internal and external changes or not is vitally important.
And I think all of us as human beings, often we don't reflect on changes that we're making. And it it takes awareness, do you know what I mean? And a bit of effort to look at the changes that we have made. Because sometimes we think, oh, nothing's changed. My life's exactly the same. But when we spend time to sit down and look at things, there's probably been an awful lot of changes.
Yeah, and for instance, some therapists, a recognition of awareness, the client
Yeah,
back awarenesses of what's happening internally or externally is a, a sign of real curative process.
yeah.
Something that's something's actually happening.
And self-reflection can be quite difficult, whereas if it's done within the therapy process,
Mm.
it's easier for us to point out changes in another person than what it is for us to acknowledge them in ourselves sometimes.
That's right. And I was talking to a TA therapist colleague of mine before we come in air, and I was talking about doing a podcast on reflections, and he said, "Oh, well, I ask all my clients to do journaling."
Yeah.
You know what I mean by journaling, Jackie?
Yeah, I think we've spoke about this before, and I think it's a really valuable exercise.
I
Yeah,
know you did. You asked your clients to journal, don't you?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to explain a little bit more about how you see the importance of journaling and perhaps what it is for the people who might not use journaling?
But again, I think it's how it's used because we can journal, some people like to call it, keeping a diary or whatever. Um, but we can journal every day for 3 months. But again, unless we're reflecting on it and looking back, we're not going to notice any changes or patterns in our behavior or those sorts of things. So again, I think it's really important to reflect back on it.
Oh, yeah. And I didn't ask my colleague, but I'm sure that he would ask his clients to bring the journals in
Yeah,
and reflect of what's been happening, externally, internally, and
yeah,
also what's been happening as a person's life as a result of therapy.
yeah, absolutely. I think it is a really valuable tool to journal.
I never did it enough, and I was reminded of this. Um, it's like a couple of years ago when somebody I worked with for 10 years, um, week in, week out, and then she was in a group as well. And she finished therapy or the duration of therapy many years ago. And she knocked on my door and she said, I'd like to come and say to you, I'm very appreciative of the work we did. I know you were a therapist that went a step further in many aspects of therapy. And also, I've written a book, you're in it.
Wow.
And I changed your name, but I wanted you to read it. And I read it. And one thing besides being a lovely book and a lovely testimony, one thing I really realized through the book, which I think after 37 years or 36 years of work, I hadn't really, I don't know, taken enough and taken it in properly, perhaps. How much, what happens in a person's life week to week. In other words, they do a piece of therapy, and then what happens in their life, they go home, and hopefully the therapeutic process and what's happening has an effect. But now through this book, I know she was in therapy a long time. She used to talk about sometimes her life was worse in therapy. Sorry, worse at home behaviorally and with her kids, through because of the therapy she did.
Yeah.
And it's like you had to take one step, two steps forwards to one step back, or whatever the phrase is. But I hadn't realized or hadn't thought about it or reflected enough on it. What happens week to week in their personal lives represents the changes or not through the therapy. And I think journaling, where a person starts reflecting on what's happening week by week and bringing it back to the therapy to explore, not only gives the chance for the therapist and client to explore what's happening, at home, but also lets the therapist know a bit about what's happening at home.
Yeah. Yeah, because we don't have that insight, do we? We're not privy to
Mm.
the changes that take place outside of, yeah.
Not unless the client brings it in, you see.
Yeah.
And that's something I thought about through this book, because I didn't realize the process was actually quite difficult for her, even though after the 10 years and perhaps I don't know how many years in, she would say the therapy was priceless and her life changed positively for it. But to get to that point, life was sometimes quite uncomfortable for her.
Yeah.
And she never reported it back to the therapist, i.e. me. So I didn't know about it. And I don't think I did enough journaling or perhaps reflecting that perhaps I could have done.
Do you think, like, I've had so many clients, I can't even begin to put a number on it, where they've turned up and they've said, I don't think I've got anything to talk about. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Literally, it feels like I was only here yesterday and everything else. Do you think clients don't use the opportunity to think about the therapy before they turn up to therapy?
Oh,
Does that
yes.
make sense?
Yes, and there's a further question though. How come?
Yeah.
Because what you just talked about there is a blocking transaction. So when somebody comes and says, and I've heard many, many times as well in my professional career, oh, I've got nothing really to talk about. Oh, I haven't really thought about what I'm going to do today. And that's a blocking transaction, and also probably true for people when they find it uncomfortable perhaps to reflect on their past, to look at the therapy that needs to happen, to look at what change might be like for them, so that they don't, in inverted commas, do anything
Yeah.
within the week to bring back, or they think they don't. Now,
Yeah.
of course, what's really important is that, oh, right, so somebody says that, oh, right, well, if you had to guess what we could talk about this week, so you aim for their child ego state, they will trot off. They'll think about it, and out of their child ego state will come all their unconscious processes. So it's a deflection sentence, and also sometimes true.
Yeah. And when they have said that at the end of the session, they've actually commented on, wow, I don't even know where all that came from, because when I walked in here, I had no idea what I was going to talk about, and yet I've not shut up for 50 minutes. Yeah.
And it's true and not true. In other
Yes.
words, part of them was just waiting for the therapist to ask, well, how was your week?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. And waiting for the therapist to say, well, just guess or tell you a little bit more. So yes and no.
Yeah.
It's
And
like
sometimes it's important to just ground them when they walk in. Do you know what I mean? If they've parked up and they've come straight from work and they've walked in and then they walk in the therapy room and you're straight on it, it's not always conducive with good therapy.
No, I agree with you. And you know, one of the most important transactions in the areas of reviews and reflections is when the therapist takes the initiation to take account of the person and ask the queries, and how have you been getting on, and
Yeah,
how's therapy been going, and have we been going down the right path? You know, that is an amazingly powerful sentence construction, because the client will feel heard.
yeah. Because that's another really important part of the reviews or the reflection, is that the treatment plan is still the right treatment plan. Because invariably it does change throughout therapy, and what they started off with isn't necessarily, where they end up.
No, that's right. And of course, um, I I often advocate the importance of recontracting,
Yes, yeah,
because sometimes, and quite often actually, when people come to therapy, they report they don't know why they've come to therapy. So what they may say at the beginning isn't always what it's about. So there might be a need for recontracting about goals and outcomes.
yeah,
Now, one way is, I think, is always, and we've talked about what we're going to say now: Christmases, Easters, Valentine's Days, all these rituals, all these really important dates in terms of what's happening for the client as a child, at the Christmases, at New Year's, at Valentine's, birthdays. All these things are such important things to review.
yeah,
Valentine's Day, for example. Often for so many people, that is such a emotive day.
yes, yeah,
Christmas, October, when they were born, all sorts of things. We need to take account of that and reflect and review what's happening for the person on these important days, and not to ignore these important moments in a person's life.
yeah. I just think it's such an important part of the whole therapy process, is the reviewing and reflection, and yeah, the awareness, bringing it in to kind of shine a light on how far they've come, and the changes that they have made in a, so that it's a really positive thing for them. Because it's heavy going therapy sometimes.
So important what you're saying here, because it gives the opportunity for celebration,
Yeah,
and celebration of a person's change and where they've come may never have happened in a person's life. They may have had a life of being defined, told what to do. So the idea of somebody asking how they are,
yeah.
what they've achieved, and celebrating that is an anathema for a lot of clients.
So how often would you review with clients? Would you, do you know what I mean? Is it like every 3 months,
Weekly?
6 months, weekly? Right.
Well, let me explain what I mean by that. One of my favorite sentences weekly with clients,
Yeah,
would be to start off transaction, not always, but invariably, with something which is true, but it's a very powerful sentence. I'll make up a name, all right? Oh, it's good to see you, Jack. I've been thinking about you. I've been thinking what we talked about last session. Let's just go back there for a moment before we continue, because you've been coming to my mind recently, and the things you've been talking about have been so important, I think. Full stop.
yeah,
Now, that is a way of accounting for the person.
absolutely. Being
That's a
seen and
way.
heard. Yeah, it's really powerful, that, Bob.
That's a way of continuance. In other words, the person will feel heard. Yeah, so I would start a lot of sessions off by that. And that, in a way, is reviewing.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
So we've got a review with a small review, like I've just said, though I think it's a very powerful sentence construction, and then review perhaps every 3 or 4 months or something.
yeah,
But I would say by reflecting and reviewing the way I'm just talking about is so important for a person that's been defined all their life. Because someone who's been defined all their life, they're never taken into account hardly.
mm,
Because they've always been told what to do. Their identity has been stolen from them.
yeah. And the fact that what you said then, that you take them out of the therapy room, that you know, it's not just you switch it on and you switch it off or whatever. If you know, I was thinking about you, or you crossed my mind this week, or whatever it is. Yeah.
Very important.
Mm,
And I think that, again, I'll repeat the same thing. For somebody who's been defined and judged, as many of our clients have for a lot of their lives, to have somebody take account for them
yeah.
is so important.
Absolutely.
So there's reviews and there's reviews. There's reflections and there's reflections. But they are very important processes within psychotherapy.
Yeah. Ones that we need to give kudos to.
But, you know, in terms of the TA theory, strokes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, what does a stroke? A unit of social recognition, positive
Yeah.
or negative. I'm
Yeah.
talking about positive strokes. Huge stroke, isn't it? When you
Yes.
say to somebody, "Oh, I've been thinking about you." You're recognizing them.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about what you were talking about last week. I think too many therapists rush on and say things like, you know, well, what do you want to discuss, you know, today or whatever.
Yes. Yeah.
Don't go back and reflect on the importance of what the person brought the previous week and what it meant, and has the new thought processes or reflections or what they did, has that actually been integrated, and what does it mean in terms of your life the last week?
Yeah.
You can tell I was a long-term psychotherapist.
Absolutely. But like you said, you know, to integrate it into the normal everyday life. If each therapy session is a standalone session on its own, where does the integration come? Where does the reflection and everything happen? Yeah, absolutely.
The reflections and reviews are essential to a successful, effective psychotherapy.
Mm. Yeah. It is in life, really, isn't it? It's like a job review. We get reviews, you know, we in a place of work. Usually, you get your annual review or your, you know, 6 monthly review to check where you are and how things are going. And I don't know whether you're keeping up with the whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, yeah, like an MOT.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm. Mm. I agree.
Very interesting, Bob. Very interesting. I think we don't self-reflect very well as human beings inside or outside of the therapy.
Well, I used to have a place in Gambia. I used to go there for 10 or 11 years, every Christmas and often at Easter. And when I first went, I was always struck by this Gambian lad I was talking to. I've been, I think, the third time I've been. And I can't remember how this came in conversation. Maybe he said, "What do you do?" or whatever. And I said, "The psychotherapist," or whatever. But I remember the conversation, which was about mental health challenges. And I said to him, "Oh, do you ever get depressed?" And he looked at me and said, "No." And then, which I didn't expect the answer. I said, "Oh, never." He said, "No, there's no time for that. There's no time for any internal reflection. It's all we always think outwards." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I'm always thinking where the next food's going to come, or
Yeah.
where I'm going to get the next money. Money and food was so there was no time for internal reflection. To survive, there was a premium on external thinking. Where's the food going?" So that's interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Think of survival needs in the Western world, for example, where a lot of our needs may be met or materialistically, or however you want to think about this. We do have more time for internal reflection than if it was the other way around, where our survival demanded on external action.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is. I think I'm getting better at self-reflection. I'm getting better at taking the time to evaluate where I am, what headspace I'm in, if that makes sense.
No, I think it's really important.
Yeah.
Certainly in the world of psychotherapy.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed this podcast.
Me too. Yeah.
Maybe later on I'll reflect and review how we've got on.
Bookmark this one to reflect and review on it, Bob. So what we'll be talking about in the next podcast, which I'm not sure where this one's going to go, is what do we say after we say hello in the therapy room?
Oh, well, that's a good one. Was this one 192nd podcast?
The one that we're doing now is 195.
So the one next week,
196.
Well, there was a very famous book written. I'll wait till we do it next week before I launch into what we say after we say hello.
Okay. So until next time, Bob, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back next week with another episode.